Hello everybody and welcome to week 9 of our Introduction to Literature class. This week is an exciting week because we are starting our novel for the class. We're going to be reading the first half of the novel this week, the second half of the novel next week, and then there'll be a take-home exam the following week. We just finished Proof by David Auburn, and reading your discussions and hearing from some of you. I know a lot of you really liked that play. I love that play as well. What's so interesting to me is how Catherine develops through the story. I think she's a dynamic character. I think she learns. She certainly grows. She comes out of herself to introduce herself to the math world, to share her ideas, and she gets out of the house. Instead of being trapped in that house like the father, she kind of comes out of it at the end. What's interesting is she ends the story at a crossroads. What's Catherine going to do? Is she going to stay in Chicago and work on her math? Is she going to start a relationship up with Hal? Is she going to move to New York and be taken care of by her sister? Is she going to do something completely different? She has revealed herself to the math world, so my guess is that might provide a clue where she ends up. If there was a Proof Part 2 sequel, I would imagine she's in Chicago living her life as a brilliant mathematician. Don't forget that play. We are going to be thinking a bit about it as we read Winter's Bone, and then when we get to the exam in 3 weeks, one of the essay questions that you can choose to do asks you to reflect on Catherine and the main character in this story, Winter's Bone. So don't put Proof too far out of your mind. Let's talk a little bit about Winter's Bone. It was written in 2006. Although I imagine Daniel Woodrell spent some time working on it before then. In fact, I know he did. He developed the novel over years. He is a writer out of southern Missouri, a place known as the Ozarks. And this was his 8th novel, probably his most famous novel. Most likely due to the fact that it was a movie starring Jennifer Lawrence that got a lot of praise when it came out. If you choose to watch the movie, which I think is absolutely fine, it's a pretty good movie, it does vary in terms of the plot. So don't just watch the film and think that's enough for this. The exam in particular asks specific things about the book plot, not the movie plot. So there are some differences. Although I think it's a good movie, and it's shot in the community that Daniel Woodrell lives in, which is what he's writing about, this Ozark area of the country. And so you get a chance, a flavor for that, a feel for that in the film. Jennifer Lawrence is okay as Ree. I really like the teardrop character, but they made some changes to him that I don't like. So it's a complicated review, but it's worth checking out if you, I think it's on Netflix right now. So, let's see here. Just a few little things to think about when we think about Daniel Woodrell and his writing. He grew up in the Ozarks. He moved away, went to get an MFA, and then came back to the Ozarks, primarily because he wanted to be with his family, but also it's a cheap place to live. And when you're writing novels, it's not a lucrative business. So he found a house that was inexpensive and allowed him to dedicate his time to writing. This book has a great hero in it named Ree Dolly, and she is part of this family in the community known as the Dollies. Her father is very famous in the community for nefarious deeds, and she carries the weight of that on her shoulders. We find her in the first chapter, which I'll cover here in a second, alone, without help, and taking care of 2 siblings and a sick mother. Woodrell says he based the hard-knock-boiled Dollykin on the West Plains Collins family, who, like the Dollies, shared a tangled family tree. The West Plains phone book lists 250 Collinses, many of them inhabiting a stretch of Highway 14 unofficially named Collinsville. It's a place the charred remains of shacks consumed by methamphetamine lab fires, of dilapidated single-wides with guinea hens dithering out front. Here, 4-wheelers double as beer-drinking stools. And again, I just put this quote up here. It's from the article Hillbilly Noir, which is something I want you to read this week. Just remember that Woodrell is writing out of experience. This novel is made up of characters that he sees in his daily life. It's not 100% view of the Ozarks. And I think a lot of people coming out of this novel do sometimes get upset about its portrayal of the Ozarks. But he's portraying this particular world. And also, this is fiction. It's not realism. And I think we need to remember that when we're reading this too, that this is a made-up story. We're talking about the Ozarks, and in particular, I think right about here, somewhere near Springfield Plateau, and maybe it's just near these mountains, the Boston Mountains. Sorry about that. Here's a image from the movie with Jennifer Lawrence as Ree. Again, like I said, plot's different in the movie, so don't just rely on the movie. But what's good and interesting about the film is it was shot in the Ozarks. In this house is an actual house in the community. It wasn't a set that they built. In fact, when they were researching using this house, one of the young girls who lives there was running around, and the filmmakers and producers decided to actually put that young girl into the film as one of Ree's siblings. In the book, Ree has two brothers. In the movie, she has a brother and a sister. One of the slight changes. Let's take a look at this first chapter, and I think we're going to see some of these motifs, and then I'll cover the different motifs that were, or the themes or ideas or recurring content in the novel. So here we go. I'm going to read it out loud as best I can. Chapter 1. Ree Dolly stood at break of day on her cold front steps and smelled coming flurries and saw meat. I'm going to read that sentence again because it's just such a good sentence. Ree Dolly stood at break of day on her cold front steps and smelled coming flurries and saw meat. Meat hung from trees across the creek. The carcasses hung pale of flesh with a fatty gleam from low limbs of saplings in the side yards. 3 halt, haggard houses formed a kneeling rank on the far creek side, and each had 2 or more skinned torsos dangling by rope from sag limbs. Venison left to the weather for 2 nights and 3 days, so the early blossoming of decay might round the flavor, sweeten that meat to the bone. Snow clouds had replaced the horizon, capped the valley darkly, and chafing wind blew, so the hung meat twirled from jiggling branches. Ree, brunette and 16, with milk, skin, and abrupt green eyes, stood bare-armed in a fluttering, yellowed dress, face to the wind, her cheeks reddening as if smacked and smacked again. She stood tall in combat boots, scarce at the waist but plenty through the arms and shoulders, a body made for loping after needs. She smelled the frosty wet and the looming clouds, thought of her shadowed kitchen and lean cupboard, looked at the scant wood pile, shuddered. The coming weather meant wash hung outside would freeze into planks, so she'd have to stretch the clothesline across the kitchen above the wood stove, and the puny stack of wood split for the potbelly would not last long enough to dry much, except Mom's underthings and maybe a few t-shirts for the boys. Ree knew there was no gas for the chainsaw, so she'd be swinging the axe out back while winter blew into the valley and fell around her. Jessup, her father, had not set by a fat wood pile nor split what there was for the potbelly before he went down the steep yard to his blue capri and bounced away on the rut road. He had not set food by nor money, but promised he'd be back soon as he could with a paper sack of cash and a trunk-load of delights. Jessup was a broken-faced, furtive man, given to uttering quick, pleading promises that made it easier for him to walk out the door and be gone, or come back inside and be forgiven. Walnuts were still falling when Ree saw him last. Walnuts were thumping to the ground in the night like stalking footsteps of some large thing that never quite came into view. And Jessup had paced down this porch in a worried slouch, dented nose snuffling, lantern jaw smoked by beard, eyes uncertain and alarmed by each walnut thump. The darkness and those thumps in the darkness seemed to keep him jumpy. He paced until the decision popped into his head, then started down the steps, going fast into the night. Before his mind could change, he said, "Start looking for me as soon as you see my face. Till then, don't even wonder." She heard the door squeak behind, and Harold, age 8, dark and slight, stood in pale long johns, holding the knob, fidgeting from foot to foot. He raised his chin, gestured toward the meat trees across the creek. Maybe tonight Blonde Milton will bring us by one to eat. That could be, said Ree. Don't Ken ought to? It's what is always said, said Ree. Could be we should ask. She looked at Harold with his easy smile, black hair rifling in the wind, then snatched his nearest ear and twisted until his jaw fell loose. And he raised his hand to swat at her. She twisted until he bore up under the pain and stopped swatting. Never, never ask for what ought to be offered. I'm cold, he said. He rubbed his smarting ears. Quit's all we got. Butter and more. There's still a tap butter. He held the door, and they both stepped inside. No, there ain't. Whew. So, in that first chapter, I think we're introduced here to many of these different motifs. I hope you noticed the language in that passage as well. And let me just share this with you before we get into the motifs. This again is from that article, Hillbilly Noir. You can find it in the Week 9 content. It says, Woodrell displays a keen ear for the linguistic quirks of the Ozarks, where grated Parmesan is called sprinkle cheese. A first name is one's front name, the dining room table is the eating table, and if one parts are gathered, sanity prevails. I hope you noticed the strange, peculiar language in that first chapter. It feels almost more poetic than like prose. Words are removed, and there's a lot of imagery used. The words carry a significant amount of weight. I read somewhere that this book started about 450 pages, and Woodrell just kept chopping away bits and pieces until he just had it perfect. And so pay attention to the language. I think it's very beautiful. Getting to those motifs, we see this young girl, Ree, who's described as brunette and 16, with milk skin and abrupt green eyes. And she's standing on that porch in combat boots with her face in the wind. It's red and it almost looks like it's been smacked and smacked again. We see her taking care of 2 siblings and a mother. And what is she worried about here? The basics of survival. Clothing, heat, and food. She's looking across the way at these deer hanging in trees. Some of you have probably seen this before during hunting season, which is right now actually coming up. But if you haven't, this is a way to take care of the animal, dress the animal, and then even let that rot seep in for a few days to round the flavor of the meat. So we see here pretty basic needs not being met. And who's in charge? Ree. We see the weather, these looming clouds coming in, a storm right over the horizon. It's morning. What better time to start a novel than in the morning? Maybe the novel will end in the night. We'll see. I don't know. We don't see any water moments here, but this is something to watch for when we're reading the novel. There's a lot of interesting moments that involve water. Water is a conventional symbol for rebirth, rejuvenation, baptism. Ree has a deep connection with nature in this book, and it's something, as you're reading, mark all those passages where you see her having a connection with nature. It's the other essay question on the exam. We see here how she describes her father. Last time she saw him was when the walnuts were falling. It's not a calendar time or even a seasonal time. It's a deep connection with a particular tree in that region. Ree relies on nature for shelter, but she also relies on it for companionship. The setting does seem to reflect the character here. The tone here is kind of dark and sad, and I think we see that in the setting itself. Ree has an enormous amount of responsibility for a 16-year-old. Taking care of 2 siblings, a missing father, and a mother who's really incapacitated. She is the caregiver in that house. And we see her thinking about the fuel for the chainsaw, how she's going to heat the home, and doing laundry. In this book, life lessons are going to come with physical pain. We see that with her brother when he's asking about whether or not they should ask for the meat. And she says no, and she takes his ear and twists it. And watch, we'll talk more about this next week, but watch for the difference between cultural laws and societal laws. Societal laws are ones we all follow with courts and police officers. Cultural laws are more what your obligation is to your culture. And I think Ree struggles with this throughout the book. She's pulled down by her culture. She's pulled down by her family. But she also embraces some aspects of it too. All right, enjoy the novel. You're reading the first half this week. You got a quiz and a discussion. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out. Take care.